Sit. Still.
That's all Celia heard before the woman's hand came down fast and hard across her cheek. The slap cracked through the quiet first-class cabin like a firecracker. Trays rattled. Champagne glasses wobbled. And 6-year-old Celia Monroe shrank into her seat, stunned, her small body curling around a worn polar bear plush that suddenly felt like the only safe thing in the world. She didn't scream. She didn't cry. She just stopped moving. Her pale skin turned pink where the slap landed, and for a second, everything went completely still. "Did you just hit my daughter?" Celia's mother, Isadora Monroe, said, her voice low, tight with disbelief. "She was kicking the seat," the flight attendant snapped. "We don't tolerate that kind of behavior in premium cabins." Her name was Martha Klein, a senior flight attendant with 30 years under her belt and a reputation for keeping order. She didn't flinch. She didn't apologize. She just adjusted her collar like she'd done the right thing. And somewhere in row 3, a man quietly lowered his phone, the screen still recording. His thumb hovered for a second, then tapped. Send. He didn't work for the airline, but he knew exactly who needed to see that footage. Celia sat frozen, her legs tucked up, eyes glassy. She hadn't meant to be disruptive. She had a mild, neurological condition. Harmless, just some uncoordinated movement when she got nervous. It wasn't misbehavior. It wasn't defiance. It was just her body trying to cope. Isadora leaned down, her lawyer instinct screaming, but her heart aching harder. "I'm right here, baby," she whispered. "You didn't do anything wrong." No one else spoke. No one stood up. Not yet. But 4,000 miles away, in a quiet office in Zurich, a man named Dr. Hugo Linwood was monitoring Flight 227 in real time, watching the metrics, the feed, and now, the clip. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't call the airline. He just leaned forward, reached for his secure console, and keyed in a single override. 3 minutes later, the $940 million system he built shut them out, and the world would never fly the same again. Dr. Hugo Linwood didn't believe in yelling. He believed in systems. And the system he'd spent the last 9 years designing, SkyGuardian, had just recorded its first red-level breach. He didn't need to see the whole video. The system had already flagged the audio spike, facial stress markers on the child, and a clear violation of Clause 9, passenger under protection, minor, non-aggressive. Hugo sat quietly in his Zurich office, surrounded by 6 screens glowing soft blue. His fingers moved with deliberate calm across the secure console, eyes scanning the alerts cascading down the leftmost monitor. Time of incident, 14:12 GMT. Passenger ID, Celia Monroe. Relation, granddaughter. His jaw tightened. He hadn't wanted Celia involved in the beta testing. She was just a little girl. But the Lisbon-Boston route was one of the few trial flights running the new real-time ethics surveillance protocol. He'd checked the manifest out of habit and noticed her name the day before. She had no idea she was riding under provisional ethics shield status. No one did, not even the crew. That was the point. Authenticity. And now it was working. The system had triggered its fail-safe lock, automatically revoking Atlantic Eagle's access to $940 million in umbrella liability coverage. Within seconds, their allied carriers in 11 countries received non-compliance pings. The system didn't ask for permission. It enforced policy. Hugo stood slowly and walked to the window. Snow dusted the glass. For the first time in a long time, he felt no guilt pressing the override. This wasn't about money. This was about accountability, about a child who had done nothing wrong, and the quiet power it took to make sure she never doubted her worth again. Back on the plane, no one knew what had started. No one knew what had just been set in motion. But the system knew, and it had already begun writing the report that would shake the aviation industry by morning. "We'll be handling their exit privately." That was the flight manager's instruction, delivered in a tight whisper through Martha's earpiece just 20 minutes before landing in Boston. Martha Klein nodded, unfazed. To her, it was just another case of entitled passengers overreacting. The girl had been fidgeting. She'd acted. End of story. What she didn't expect was the silence from the rest of the crew. Most of them had seen the slap. A few had even caught Celia's face afterward. How she didn't cry, just folded inward. But nobody spoke. Nobody challenged Martha. And now, with corporate already aware something had gone wrong, everyone shifted into cover-up mode. Isadora Monroe, still calm on the surface, had asked one simple question after the incident. "Is this how your airline treats children with disabilities?" Martha didn't answer. Instead, she filed a crew report stating that Celia had been aggressive, repeatedly disobeyed instructions, and physically disruptive to nearby passengers. There were no other signatures on the statement, just hers. Down in the back galley, a younger flight attendant named Joel glanced at his phone, then at Martha's report. He knew it wasn't true. He'd seen the slap, and more importantly, he'd seen the man in row 3 recording it. He also saw the moment that man sent the footage, but Joel stayed quiet, because on this flight, silence was safer than integrity. By the time the plane landed, a black car had been discreetly dispatched to the far side of Logan Airport. Celia and Isadora were escorted off the plane through a secondary gate. No media, no other passengers, no scene. As if it never happened. But someone had already uploaded the video, and Dr. Hugo Linwood had already attached it to a system-wide violation report, flagging Martha Klein's name with the highest possible ethics infraction. Tier Red. Verified assault. Passenger under protection. Pending full investigation. The airline thought they'd buried it. They didn't realize they'd just triggered a storm. It started as a ripple, one ethics notification in a sea of daily alerts. But the moment SkyGuardian flagged Atlantic Eagle as non-compliant with Clause 9, the system did what it was built to do: escalate without warning. Within 12 minutes, 3 major aviation insurers received breach reports tied to Atlantic Eagle's flight personnel. Their response? Freeze all active claims and pause premium coverage. That included $67 million in pending reimbursements, $202 million in international travel bonds, and $670 million in shared liability trust pools. It didn't stop there. SkyGuardian also synced with the GEF Ethics Board, which meant 14 federal airports, including Boston Logan, LAX, and Toronto Pearson, received simultaneous alerts. Flagged airline may be in violation of federal passenger protection codes. Consider suspending VIP lounge and gate privileges until reviewed. By the time the flight crew had finished their post-landing checklist, the airline's internal system was already locked out of multiple platforms. Customer service couldn't access elite member data. Baggage control lost clearance in Frankfurt. Their own mobile app glitched and gray-screened, and still, no one knew why. Meanwhile, in a small hotel room in Boston, Celia was fast asleep, holding her polar bear tight. Isadora sat beside her, reading the early alerts forwarded discreetly by an old friend at the Department of Transportation. She didn't smile. She didn't celebrate. But her eyes, once raw with grief, now held something calmer. Resolve. She knew it wasn't over. Martha would lie. The airline would spin. The press might twist it all into a misunderstanding. But what they couldn't erase was data. Every biometric tremor in Celia's face, every audio spike, every recorded moment, that lived inside SkyGuardian now. And SkyGuardian didn't forget. The first public headline dropped at 6:42 a.m. Flight attendant allegedly slapped 6-year-old in first class. Ethics system triggers industry lockout. It didn't mention names, yet. But someone on the Aviation Ethics Forum had already leaked the SkyGuardian flag report. And that changed everything. By 8 o'clock a.m., the tags #Clause 9 and #Celia Monroe were trending in the US, Canada, and the UK Reddit threads dissected the system logs. TikTok lawyers broke down the meaning of passenger under protection. Twitter, or X depending on the time of day, exploded with outrage. And the airline's PR team? Scrambling. The official statement read like every corporate damage control playbook. We are aware of an incident aboard Flight 227. We take allegations of misconduct seriously. An internal review is underway. It was too little, too late. Internally, chaos unfolded. Executives at Atlantic Eagle tried to override SkyGuardian's classification, only to find their access revoked. Even their legal team couldn't contact the GEP ethics board directly. Why? Because someone high, had triggered a level red lock. In a conference room on the 28th floor of Atlantic Eagle HQ, the CEO stared at the blinking dashboard. His CFO had just whispered, "If we can't reinstate coverage in the next 72 hours, we're looking at a potential 400 mm exposure." Silence. Someone finally asked, "Who's behind SkyGuardian?" No one answered. Back in Boston, Isadora watched the headlines scroll in silence. She didn't speak to reporters. She didn't post anything online. She didn't have to, because the system her father-in-law built was doing the talking for her. And for the first time in aviation history, a 6-year-old silent trauma had brought an entire industry to its knees. It didn't take long. By noon, journalists and aviation insiders began asking the same question. Who exactly is behind SkyGuardian? The platform wasn't public. It wasn't marketed. But it had teeth, real regulatory consequences. And no one seemed to know who had the power to trigger a $940 million system-wide shutdown without even calling a single agency. Until one name surfaced, Dr. Hugo Linwood, a low-profile but deeply respected data systems architect, former ethics advisor for the International Civil Aviation Federation. Quiet, private. But then someone leaked a detail that cracked it wide open. He's the child's grandfather. The internet took it from there. Old articles, conference photos, a 2014 speech he gave about dignity engineering, designing systems that protect those too small, too quiet, too dismissed, and a single image of him standing beside a much younger Celia, holding her hand on a snowy bridge in Lucerne. The moment that photo went viral, everything changed. The story wasn't just about a slap anymore. It was about how one man embedded protection into the code itself, how he turned heartbreak into infrastructure, and how he'd stayed silent while the system he built did exactly what he meant it to do. At Atlantic Eagle headquarters, panic turned to pressure. A call came from Geneva, then Brussels, then Ottawa. You're being summoned for emergency review by the Global Ethics Board. Prepare documentation for Clause 9 breach, and be aware, media coverage has reached ethics markets in Singapore and Sydney. No press release could spin this, because SkyGuardian didn't just flag misconduct, it recorded intent. And now, with Hugo Linwood's name attached, the airline wasn't just facing a PR crisis. They were standing trial in front of a system designed by the man whose granddaughter they tried to silence. By Tuesday morning, Atlantic Eagle's name had been temporarily suspended from 3 major international airport systems: Toronto Pearson, Heathrow, Zurich. The reason? A single phrase repeated across each ethics bulletin. Pending Clause 9 compliance review, all privileges on hold. That meant no fast-track boarding lanes, no priority clearance for international customs, and worst of all, no VIP lounge access for corporate contracts. The ripple effect hit hard. Several investment funds began pulling exposure from the airline's portfolio. ESG watchdogs flagged their stock. And in a closed-door meeting, 2 European tourism boards froze their seasonal partnership renewals, pending investigation outcome. But the most brutal blow? A televised public ethics hearing, mandated by the Global Ethics Board. It aired Wednesday evening. The panel sat in a sterile chamber in Brussels. On screen, the airline's COO stammered through his opening statement, trying to frame the incident as an unfortunate miscommunication. Across from him sat Dr. Hugo Linwood, silent, hands folded, listening. When asked to speak, he didn't raise his voice. He simply said, The system registered stress in the child's eyes before her own mother noticed. It detected force before the hand made contact, and it acted not for revenge, but for protection. That's what Clause 9 is for. That's why I built it. No one interrupted him. Later that night, the hearing's highlights went viral. The clip of Hugo's words was reposted over 12 million times in 24 hours. Comments poured in from parents, veterans, teachers, people who had never been in first class but knew exactly what injustice looked like. Isadora sat at home with Celia, watching quietly. She didn't say much. She just reached for her daughter's hand. Celia whispered, "Is it over?" Isadora smiled softly. "Not yet, baby, but they're finally listening." The apology came Thursday morning. Not through a press conference, not from a senior executive, but from a slide deck. Leaked by an internal staffer, the deck outlined Atlantic Eagle's plan to proactively address public perception and accelerate regulatory alignment. Translation: the airline was trying to clean up without owning up. It wasn't working. Because while the executives scrambled, SkyGuardian was still operational, and it wasn't just flagging Atlantic Eagle anymore. Over the next 48 hours, 12 additional airlines across Europe, Asia, and the US received minor violations, quietly issued through the platform. Most were warnings, not full lockdowns. But each message contained a now familiar code. Clause 9, passenger under protection, minor, recorded discrepancy. Airlines started asking, who else is being watched? Is this active now? Everywhere? Is our crew trained for this? And one by one, systems began to shift. Some carriers suspended their internal loyalty tiers, worried about bias accusations. Others launched emergency diversity and conduct trainings. A few even paused child ticket upgrades altogether, afraid of triggering a red flag. What started as an isolated incident had become a sector-wide recalibration. Meanwhile, Hugo Linwood stayed silent. No interviews, no emails, just a single update posted quietly to the SkyGuardian site. Clause 9 enforcement protocol has entered live auditing phase. Thank you for validating the system. The message didn't name anyone, but the industry knew exactly who it was for. Back in Boston, Celia was painting at the kitchen table, a rainbow with uneven lines. A small white bear in the corner. Isadora sipped coffee as her phone buzzed again. More media requests, interview offers, feature spots. She declined every single one. She didn't need the spotlight. Her daughter had already changed the rules of air travel without saying a word. That afternoon, the Global Ethics Board released its preliminary findings. Martha Klein, the flight attendant who slapped Celia, was permanently banned from serving on any JEP-aligned airline. Atlantic Eagle was placed on federal compliance watch for 18 months. The airline's access to $940 million in shared liability coverage remained frozen. And perhaps most importantly, a new clause was introduced. Clause 9.1, auto-escalation trigger for silent minors. If a minor under protection exhibits non-verbal distress patterns, and the system detects escalating aggression from flight crew, automatic alerts will be issued to SkyGuardian, ethics boards, and, if necessary, airport authorities in real time. By Friday, parents everywhere were talking, not about what happened to Celia, but about how the system protected her without her ever needing to fight back. It was quiet, precise, and irreversible. At a press roundtable, a German journalist asked a GEP official, "Was this all about one child?" The official paused, then smiled. "No, it started with one, but now it's about protecting millions." On Monday morning, Hugo Linwood arrived in Washington, D.C., not through the front door of the Federal Ethics Commission, but through a quiet entrance 2 blocks away. No cameras, no press. He carried a thin black folder. Inside, a proposal titled, "The Passenger Dignity Framework, Clause 9 Expansion Protocol." While the world still buzzed about Celia's case, Hugo had been writing, quietly, relentlessly, using years of archived data, failure points, and loopholes he'd personally watched airlines exploit. Now, he was here to close those gaps for good. Inside a glass conference room at the Commission's private wing, 12 senior federal officials and aviation leaders sat waiting. Some were skeptical, some were nervous, but none were unprepared. Because SkyGuardian had changed everything. Hugo stood, voice even. Clause 9 was never designed to punish. It was designed to protect. But after this, we realized protection is not enough. We need accountability built into the core of the cabin. He proposed a mandatory non-verbal passenger stress monitoring system on all GEP-aligned flights. Real-time data sync with SkyGuardian for any child under 10 seated in premium cabins or traveling solo. Ethics trigger thresholds that would automatically override crew reports if manipulation was detected. And, most importantly, the establishment of a passenger ethics oversight committee with a direct civilian seat, one that Isadora Monroe would be invited to fill. The room fell silent. A federal advisor leaned forward. "You're asking to rewire the entire behavioral foundation of cabin crews. You're talking about federalizing ethics." Hugo didn't flinch. "I'm not asking. The system has already started. You just need to choose whether to lead it or chase it." Back in Boston, Isadora had just declined another national interview. She wasn't interested in being a public figure, but when she received the invitation to join the oversight committee, she stared at it for a long while. Then, for the first time in days, she smiled. Because maybe the fight wasn't over, but they weren't alone anymore. That same afternoon, the White House Communications Director confirmed that the FAA was in final review to adopt the Dignity Framework nationally. By evening, 27 international airports signed preliminary letters of intent to recognize Clause 9 as a binding ethics condition for all future carrier contracts. The next day, Hugo and Isadora met privately at a small courtyard cafe near DuPont Circle. Celia sat between them, sipping hot cocoa. She didn't understand the headlines, but she did notice how gently the waiter knelt when he brought her drink, and how he said softly, "This one's on us, sweetheart." As they walked away, Hugo looked down at his granddaughter and whispered, "Sometimes the world doesn't hear you until it has to." She looked up at him, then back at the sky. No words, just a nod. Clause 9 had started as a line of code. Now, it was a promise. It wasn't just an airline anymore. By Thursday morning, Atlantic Eagle had become a symbol for everything wrong with unchecked power in the sky. And now, it was collapsing under the weight of its own silence. The Global Ethics Board released its final ruling. Atlantic Eagle's senior operations team was suspended indefinitely. Martha Klein, the flight attendant, was placed on a no-fly personnel list, enforceable by all 61 JEP-compliant airlines. And the airline's federal operating license was placed on provisional status, pending full adoption of the Dignity Framework. But perhaps the most damning blow came from inside. A whistleblower leaked internal audio from a leadership meeting, recorded just 2 days after the incident. The file contained the COO saying, "So what if it was a kid? We've cleaned up worse." The recording hit the media like wildfire. Shareholders panicked. 4 board members resigned, and 3 global airports terminated gate agreements with the airline effective immediately. At a press conference in Geneva, the GEP ethics chair stood calmly at the podium. "Airlines that fail to uphold basic human dignity will be excluded from the future of travel. This is no longer negotiable." Behind the scenes, 31 global airlines signed on to the Passenger Dignity Framework within 72 hours, each one agreeing to mandatory Clause 9 protections, live monitoring audits, and permanent access to SkyGuardian's ethics dashboard. One reporter called it the biggest civilian-led reform in aviation history. But Hugo Linwood wasn't in Geneva. He was home, quietly coding. He'd just completed the new SkyGuardian protocol, Clause 9.2, a layered override that allowed verified passengers to request ethics review retroactively, even after landing. When asked if he planned to open source it, he paused. "Not yet. Some systems still don't deserve it." Meanwhile, Isadora faced her own decision. The Oversight Committee offered her the chair position, full-time, global authority. She turned it down. Instead, she recommended someone else. Find the parents who ride an economy with nonverbal kids. Find the woman who always gets seated last because of her name. Find the quiet ones. They know exactly what ethics should feel like. And as for Celia, she went back to school the following Monday. No one brought up the incident. No one asked about the airline. All they noticed was the small bracelet she wore, a blue band with one word etched in silver: protected. At the final federal hearing, the chairwoman asked Hugo just one question. Do you believe the system you've built is now strong enough to protect future passengers? Hugo nodded once. It's strong enough to protect them, but not strong enough to replace us. Dignity still requires human choice. The hearing ended in applause. Outside, no protests, no fireworks. Just a quiet recognition that something had shifted and wouldn't shift back. Not because of a courtroom, not because of a fine, but because one little girl didn't fight back and still changed everything. 1 year later, at a tech ethics summit in Montreal, a panel of industry leaders discussed artificial intelligence, data regulation, and global aviation reforms. Most spoke in stats, acronyms, policy jargon. Until one name came up: Clause 9. A soft murmur swept the room. The moderator cleared her throat. Some say it started with a software update. Others say it began with a child. The screen behind her lit up. No dramatic footage, no charts, just a still image. Celia Monroe, 6 years old, first class, looking out the window, unaware the world had shifted behind her. Back in Boston, the Monroe house was quiet. A late spring morning, the birds louder than usual. Isadora sat by the window with a cup of coffee, watching Celia draw at the table. This time, a house with a sun overhead, and little stick people holding hands. Celia paused and looked up. Will people still remember, Mommy? Isadora smiled, reached across the table, and gently squeezed her hand. They don't have to remember your name, sweetheart. They just have to treat the next little girl better. Outside, a plane passed overhead, its trail barely visible. But some changes don't need to be loud. Some shifts live in the silence that follows a slap. The kind of silence that's been rewired into every cabin, into every decision, into every system that once looked away. Celia went back to her drawing. Isadora leaned back in her chair, and the world moved on, slightly better than before. Because one little girl never raised her voice, but the world heard her anyway. The Aviation Museum in Seattle had never seen a line like this. It wasn't a holiday. There was no celebrity, no new aircraft on display. Just a small new wing, quiet, minimal. At the entrance, a plaque. Clause 9, designed to protect the quietest voice. Inside, visitors moved slowly through the exhibit. Not because there was so much to see, but because there was so much to feel. One wall displayed photos of real children on airplanes, smiling, sleeping, scared, safe. Another wall held a timeline, from the slap heard across the internet, to the collapse of Atlantic Eagle, to the global adoption of the Dignity Framework. And at the very end, on a single pedestal under soft white light, sat a tiny item: Celia Monroe's blue, protected bracelet. No glass, no barrier. Because protection was never meant to be locked away. Upstairs, in a private reception hall, Isadora stood with Hugo beside a small group of ethics scholars, regulators, and airline executives. She wasn't here for applause, but she accepted the quiet thank yous, the quiet nods, the quiet awareness that this room no longer ignored girls like Celia. An FAA official approached Hugo with a glass of water. We're planning to integrate Clause 9.2 into all domestic flight licenses next quarter. The Senate subcommittee just endorsed it yesterday. Hugo gave a tired but content smile. It's not about code anymore. It's about culture. That evening, as the exhibit closed for the night, a young girl walked up to the pedestal with her mother. Maybe 6, maybe 7. Blonde hair, curious eyes. She pointed at the bracelet. "What's that for?" Her mom bent down and answered softly. "It's what tells people. This child matters, even if she doesn't speak, even if no one's looking." Back in Boston, Celia didn't watch the news coverage. She wasn't interested in the museum, or the articles, or the interviews her mom declined every week. She was too busy reading, painting, growing up. But every now and then, she'd look out the window when a plane passed and whisper to herself, "They know now." Not angry, not proud, just sure. The world hadn't changed overnight. But it had shifted. Because when one person decided that silence should no longer be a weakness, when one system chose to believe a child without her needing to explain herself, dignity became the default. And Celia? She didn't need to fight for justice, because it was already waiting at the gate. If this story moved you even a little, tell us. Have you ever witnessed something unfair, but didn't know how to speak up? Or maybe, like Celia, you stayed silent, and the world finally listened. Drop your story in the comments. You never know who needs to hear it today. And if you believe every child deserves dignity, no matter where they sit, how they look, or what they say, then hit subscribe, because here on Telltales, we don't just tell stories. We remember the ones the world tried to forget.